There comes a moment in life when you begin to notice something disturbing about the world. The loudest people are rarely the strongest. The most admired people are often the most emotionally fragile. And the individuals who seem harmless are sometimes the ones controlling entire psychological environments without anyone noticing. Most people move through life trapped inside emotional programming they never chose. They chase approval without realizing approval is a leash. Chase comfort without realizing comfort weakens them. Chase attention without realizing attention exposes them. This is where people lose power, quietly, through habits that slowly destroy psychological strength from the inside. And here's the dangerous part. Society rewards these weaknesses because weak people are easier to predict, easier to influence, easier to emotionally control. But the moment you begin eliminating these weaknesses, something changes. Your perception sharpens, your emotions become quieter, your presence becomes heavier. Because real power is psychological. It is the ability to remain internally stable, while the world constantly attempts to manipulate your attention, your emotions, and your perception of reality. Manipulative people understand this very well. They know emotional individuals are easy to provoke, easy to destabilize. A person who cannot control themselves will always become vulnerable to someone who can. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The 5 things you are about to hear are the exact psychological weights that keep most people weak without realizing it. Quietly eliminate them, and your entire presence begins to transform. Thing 1. The need for approval. Most people destroy their own power long before anyone else has the chance to take it from them. Not through sudden failure, not through obvious weakness, but through something far more subtle, through exposure, through the unconscious need to be seen, understood, validated, emotionally confirmed by the eyes of other people. They speak too much when silence would protect them, reveal too much when restraint would strengthen them, explain too much when certainty would be more powerful, and in doing so, they slowly hand away every strategic advantage they could have possessed without even realizing the exchange is happening. Power has always belonged to those who understand silence. Not ordinary silence, calculated silence. The kind that reshapes perception without a single word. The kind that forces other people to project their assumptions onto you because they cannot access your inner world. And here's the dangerous part. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with what they cannot decode. The unknown creates tension. That tension becomes psychological gravity. It pulls attention. It demands interpretation. It creates distance, respect, and sometimes even fear. This is something Niccolò Machiavelli understood centuries ago. Power is never held by those who reveal too much, but by those who control perception through restraint. And the modern world has inverted this principle, rewarding exposure over strategy. The modern world teaches something entirely different. It rewards constant emotional exhibition, endless confession disguised as authenticity. People are encouraged to turn their inner life into public material. They reveal ambitions before they are formed into reality. They reveal wounds before they have been processed or healed. They reveal strategies before they are fully secured or tested. They leak their internal structure through language, believing that visibility is the same as value. But visibility is not power. In many cases, it is the opposite. It is exposure without protection. But the world rewards strategy, not innocence. The moment you understand this, your perception begins to shift in subtle but irreversible ways. You start noticing that the most dangerous individuals are rarely the loudest in the room. They do not compete for attention because attention is not their currency. They do not depend on constant recognition because recognition becomes irrelevant once influence is established. They move differently, quietly, observing more than they reveal, speaking only when precision matters. And because of this restraint, they become difficult to read, and anything that cannot be read easily becomes difficult to control. This is where the lens of Carl Jung becomes unavoidable. Jung would describe this as projection. People do not see you as you are, but as a reflection of their own unconscious patterns. And the more you expose, the more material you give others to project, distort, and manipulate your image. Manipulative people understand this dynamic very well. They understand that information is not neutral. Information is leverage. Every emotional reaction you expose becomes material that can be studied later. It becomes data that can be used to predict your behavior, influence your decisions, or destabilize your emotional balance when needed. Most people never realize how often they are giving away internal access simply by reacting too quickly, speaking too openly, or trying too hard to be understood. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. From a Stoic perspective, as taught by Marcus Aurelius, this is where power begins, not in controlling others, but in controlling what is permitted to control you. External validation becomes irrelevant when internal stability is complete. You begin to realize that power is not only built through accumulation of skills, status, or resources. It is built through subtraction, through the quiet removal of anything that makes you predictable, through eliminating behaviors that leak emotional instability, through refining your habits until nothing unnecessary remains exposed, slowly, deliberately, without announcement, without validation, without explanation to anyone watching, because real transformation never performs itself for an audience. Thing 2. Emotional impulsiveness. Most people genuinely believe emotions are meant to be expressed immediately, as if every internal impulse deserves instant release. React instantly, defend instantly, attack instantly, reveal instantly. They live as though speed equals strength, as though the first emotional reaction is always the most honest version of themselves. But impulsive emotion is one of the fastest ways to surrender strategic control over your own behavior without even realizing the transfer has taken place. Because every uncontrolled reaction exposes your internal structure, not your surface personality, but the underlying architecture beneath it, your insecurities, your attachments, your unresolved fears, your dependency points. Manipulative people understand this very well, often intuitively. They do not need to study you for long. They only need to provoke you once, sometimes slightly, almost invisibly, just enough to see where your emotional balance breaks. Because reactions are never neutral. They always reveal something. Anger reveals where control is missing. Defensiveness reveals where identity is fragile. Desperation reveals where attachment is too strong. The emotional person does not just express themselves. They leak information continuously without realizing they are speaking in a language others can read effortlessly, and the calm observer collects it silently. This is why emotional discipline has always been associated with power across history. Not because powerful people feel less emotion. That is a misunderstanding. They often feel more intensely, not less. But they refuse to allow temporary internal states to become external commands. They understand that emotions are conditions, not instructions. When emotion takes control, perception narrows, time compresses. Judgment becomes reactive instead of strategic. In moments of anger, fear, humiliation, or desire, the The mind stops seeing systems and starts reacting to fragments. And in fragmented perception, people make predictable decisions. And here's the dangerous part. Most people do not even realize they are emotionally predictable. A single insult can reroute their entire behavior. A single rejection can collapse their confidence for days. A single moment of praise can override their judgment and create false trust. Their internal world is not self-governed. It is externally programmable through emotional triggers. And those who understand this do not need force or authority in the traditional sense. They only need timing, language, and pressure points. This is where people lose power, not in dramatic confrontations, but in small emotional ruptures they never recover from cleanly. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus described a principle that fits this precisely. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies freedom. Most people never access that space because they collapse directly from stimulus into reaction. No pause, no observation, no distance, just immediate emotional execution. But power begins exactly where that space is reclaimed, where reaction is no longer automatic, but chosen. Sun Tzu understood a similar principle from a strategic perspective. Victory is not achieved in the moment of conflict, but in the control of conditions before conflict even begins. If your emotional state can be dictated by another person, then your decisions are already partially outsourced. And once decisions are outsourced, control is no longer fully yours, even if you believe you are acting freely. And once you begin to see this, human behavior becomes almost transparent. You notice how easily crowds are guided through fear, how quickly individuals abandon principles under pressure, how effortlessly people reveal their intentions when discomfort is applied at the right angle. Most do not resist emotional force. They follow it, believing it is their own will, when in reality, it is triggered response dressed up as choice. But emotional mastery requires distance, not suppression, not denial, but distance. The pause becomes your weapon. In that pause, something fundamental changes. You are no longer inside the reaction. You are observing it. And once you can observe it without becoming it, emotional systems that used to control you begin to lose authority. Not because emotions disappear, but because they stop being automatic rulers of behavior. And that is where real control begins. Thing 3. Addiction to comfort. Comfort looks harmless at first. It arrives quietly, disguised as safety, safe routines, familiar environments, predictable emotional patterns that reduce internal tension and create the illusion of stability. But comfort does not remain passive for long. Over time, it begins to reshape perception itself. The mind adapts to ease, and in that adaptation, it slowly loses tolerance for disruption, uncertainty, and friction. And here's the dangerous part. The world does not belong to those who remain comfortable. It belongs to those who can function inside uncertainty without collapsing into hesitation. Most people cannot. They require emotional guarantees before action. They require certainty before movement. They require reassurance before risk. They wait for conditions that feel safe enough to proceed, as if life is ever structured to provide permanent safety. And because that certainty never arrives in full, they remain suspended in cycles of delay, observation, and hesitation, while more decisive individuals quietly move forward and take position in environments that others were too afraid to enter. Schopenhauer understood this mechanism at a deeper level than most are willing to admit. He described human behavior as fundamentally driven by avoidance of discomfort, a constant movement away from tension rather than toward truth. This is why most people do not consciously choose ignorance. They drift into it because awareness itself carries weight. To see clearly is to feel clearly, and to feel clearly often means confronting aspects of existence and self that are easier to avoid than to integrate. So, the mind learns escape, not once, but repeatedly, until escape becomes identity. People turn toward entertainment not as a choice, but as a reflex. Toward pleasure, not as enjoyment, but as avoidance. Toward noise, stimulation, distraction, anything that prevents stillness from emerging. Because stillness is not empty. Stillness is revealing. It removes external input and forces attention inward. And what it reveals is often what people spend their entire lives trying not to see. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You begin noticing how modern environments are structured not just to entertain, but to pacify. Comfort is not accidental, it is reinforcing. A comfortable mind is predictable. A predictable mind is easy to guide. And a mind constantly occupied rarely develops the friction necessary for transformation. Because transformation does not occur in ease. It occurs in resistance, in pressure, in situations that force adaptation instead of avoidance. This is why comfort, over time, becomes a form of psychological softening, not immediately destructive, but gradually weakening. The threshold for difficulty lowers. Small inconveniences begin to feel heavier than they are. Emotional discomfort starts to feel like threat, and the individual slowly becomes fragile, not because the world becomes harsher, but because their tolerance for harshness diminishes. The comfortable person becomes fragile, not suddenly, but structurally. And from the perspective of Friedrich Nietzsche, this is where stagnation begins, when life is arranged to avoid struggle, instead of using struggle as a condition for strengthening. Growth in this sense is never separate from resistance. Without pressure, there is no refinement. Without friction, there is no sharpening. Without discomfort, there is no expansion of capacity. The moment you understand this, comfort stops appearing as safety. It begins to look like limitation. And once that shift happens internally, your relationship with uncertainty changes completely. You stop treating discomfort as something to escape from and begin recognizing it as the environment where strength is actually formed. Not emotionally pleasant, but structurally necessary. Because in the end, comfort does not destroy you instantly. It makes you less able to respond when life inevitably becomes uncomfortable again. Thing 4. The need to explain yourself. This habit destroys more authority than people realize, because it rarely looks like weakness on the surface. It appears as politeness, as clarity, as responsibility. But underneath that surface is something far more revealing. A quiet dependence on being understood correctly. A need to be interpreted favorably. A need to repair every possible misunderstanding before it even fully exists. Weak individuals constantly justify themselves because they are not only speaking, they are negotiating their identity in real time. They explain decisions excessively, defend boundaries excessively, clarify intentions excessively. And each time they do, they believe they are strengthening communication, when in reality, they are exposing internal uncertainty. Because people who are internally certain do not feel compelled to constantly translate themselves. They act, they decide, they move forward, and allow reality to interpret them without constant correction. And the world notices immediately. Not consciously, but instinctively. Human perception is extremely sensitive to signals of insecurity hidden inside language. The more someone explains, the more it creates the impression that something fragile is being protected underneath. Power, on the other hand, often carries an absence of explanation, not because it hides truth, but because it does not depend on approval for validation. Powerful individuals understand something most people never fully internalize. Not everyone deserves access to your reasoning. Not everyone deserves emotional transparency. Not everyone deserves complete understanding of your internal decision-making process. Some people are not asking questions to understand you. They are asking to map you, to find structure, to identify pressure points, to discover where influence can enter. Manipulative individuals understand this very well. They ask questions strategically, not to understand you, but to observe you understanding yourself. The more you explain, the more you reveal the architecture behind your decisions, your hesitations, your emotional triggers, your attachments, your fear of judgment. Every additional sentence becomes data, and over time, that data forms a predictable psychological model of who you are and how you can be influenced. Most people never realize this because they confuse openness with strength. But openness without discernment is not strength. It is exposure without strategy. Selective silence, by contrast, is not deception. It is control over what is made available for interpretation. And here's the dangerous part. The need to explain yourself rarely comes from logic. It comes from emotional insecurity, from the unresolved fear of rejection, from the desire to be seen correctly in a world that constantly misreads intention. You begin to believe that if you can just articulate yourself perfectly enough, people will finally perceive you as you intend to be perceived. But this is where the illusion breaks, because perception is never fully controllable. Here, the thinking of Michel Foucault becomes relevant, not as a quote, but as a lens. He showed how power is deeply connected to interpretation, surveillance, and the way people are read within systems. Once you exist in the awareness that you are being interpreted, you begin to understand that explanation does not eliminate misinterpretation. It only multiplies the surface area through which you can be analyzed. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. You stop trying to control every misunderstanding. You stop over-justifying yourself to people who were never evaluating you fairly in the first place. You realize that constant explanation does not create clarity. It creates dependence on how you are received. And slowly something shifts. Silence stops feeling like guilt and starts feeling like authority. Because in the absence of unnecessary explanation, your actions begin to stand alone, unfiltered, uninterpreted, and no longer constantly begging to be approved. Thing 5. Attachment to illusions. This is the deepest elimination of all, because it does not concern behavior alone. It concerns perception itself, the way you interpret reality, the way you assign meaning to people, events, outcomes, and expectations. Most suffering does not come from reality in its raw form. It comes from the collision between reality and illusion, between what is and what was assumed to be true. Human beings do not experience life directly. They experience interpretations of life, carefully constructed internal narratives that soften uncertainty and give emotional structure to chaos. People build these narratives everywhere, about relationships, about loyalty, about society, about morality, about success, about identity. They construct invisible frameworks that tell them how the world should behave, how others should respond, how outcomes are supposed to unfold. And for a time, these frameworks feel stable, even comforting. They create the illusion of order in a reality that is fundamentally unpredictable. But reality does not negotiate with illusion. At some point, it disrupts it. Quietly at first, then completely. Expectations collapse. People behave differently than imagined. Outcomes refuse to follow emotional logic. And when this gap becomes too large, the illusion breaks. And most people do not simply feel disappointment. They experience identity rupture because they were not just believing the illusion, they were living inside it, not because truth is unbearable, but because they built themselves around a version of reality that never existed. Schopenhauer understood this dynamic at its core. He described human desire as a structure that never reaches completion, not because people fail individually, but because desire itself is constructed in a way that regenerates endlessly. When one object of desire is obtained, another immediately takes its place. Satisfaction is always temporary, because it is always dependent on external conditions that are constantly shifting. So the mind learns to project onto relationships, onto status, onto wealth, onto recognition, onto power, as if external acquisition could stabilize something internal that was never designed to be stabilized externally in the first place. This projection is not a mistake. It is a mechanism, but it is also the source of continuous disappointment, because reality never commits to sustaining illusions. And here's the dangerous part. Society does not accidentally maintain illusion. It structurally benefits from it. People function more predictably when they are emotionally invested in narratives that keep them hopeful, compliant, and externally oriented. Illusion keeps attention directed outward instead of inward. It keeps individuals chasing meaning instead of questioning structure. It keeps behavior emotionally driven rather than strategically aware. And most importantly, it keeps people participating in systems they would otherwise evaluate more critically if they saw them without narrative distortion. But powerful individuals begin to separate perception from projection, not cynically, precisely. They stop expecting fairness from a world that does not operate on fairness as a primary principle. They stop expecting loyalty from people whose loyalty is conditional and unstable. They stop expecting permanence from conditions that are inherently temporary. This is not emotional detachment in the sense of emptiness. It is psychological alignment with reality as it is, not as it is wished to be. In this sense, Arthur Schopenhauer becomes unavoidable again, because his philosophy is not just about pessimism, but about clarity. The recognition that suffering often comes from the mismatch between desire and reality itself. Once that mismatch is seen clearly, emotional responses begin to shift, not because feeling disappears, but because expectation is no longer disguised as certainty. And once you see this structure, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice how much of everyday disappointment is not caused by events themselves, but by the collapse of internal narratives that were never guaranteed by reality in the first place. And slowly, something changes in how you engage with the world. You become less reactive to outcomes, less dependent on interpretation, less attached to imagined stability. This does not make you disconnected from life. It makes you no longer surprised by it. And that is where psychological preparedness begins. Not in control over reality, but in the removal of illusion about it. Most people spend their lives trying to acquire power, without realizing that power is first created through subtraction, not addition, elimination. You eliminate the need for approval, eliminate emotional impulsiveness, eliminate addiction to comfort, eliminate the need to explain yourself, eliminate attachment to illusion, and slowly, something changes inside you. Your mind becomes quieter, sharper, less emotionally negotiable. You stop reacting to everything. Stop chasing everyone. Stop leaking energy through unnecessary emotion, unnecessary words, unnecessary attachment. The world begins to look different because your perception is no longer clouded by dependency. And here's the dangerous part. Once this transformation begins, you can never fully return to unconsciousness again. You begin seeing manipulation hidden inside kindness, weakness hidden inside excessive niceness, fear hidden inside arrogance, desperation hidden inside attention-seeking. Most people never reach this awareness because awareness carries responsibility. The moment you truly see reality, you lose the comfort of illusion forever. But you also gain something else: control. Not control over the world, control over yourself. And that is where all real power begins.